Hi, everybody. My name is Michaela Weaver. I'm an attorney with the KJC Law Firm. And with me here today, I have Meg Preston, who's currently a school nurse at North Middlesex Regional High School. And she's going to talk to us today about her specialized experience dealing with traumatic brain injuries. Hi, Meg. Thank you so much for being here. If you could just introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your work to start.
Hi, Michaela. I've been a school nurse at a high school for over 10 years. Prior to that, I worked at a whole variety of school levels, from grade school through high school in several different towns, part-time and sometimes just substitute nursing. So and that was probably for another 5 years. And prior to that, I worked in the hospital setting with over 10 years at the Shriners-Burns Institute and at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. That's my experience.
Very impressive background there. Now, as far as traumatic brain injuries go, have you dealt with that a lot in your work overall? Could you talk a little bit about your experience dealing with head injuries and what that sort of has been like for you?
Sure. So I will say that as a nurse, in my experience prior to a high school setting, the brain injuries that I experienced weren't that often. Except when I worked at the Shriners-Burns Institute, we did see a fair share of anoxic brain injury when the brain is, deprived of oxygen during house fires. But I will say in the high school setting, I see my fair share of concussions, which is one form of brain injury. And I definitely see a lot of that at the high school level because high schoolers are such a high risk, the athletes, that is.
And that's interesting you mentioned high school specifically. Now, you said concussions. Now, personally, traumatic brain injuries, I know this now, it sort of encompasses a bunch of different types of injuries. I know you mentioned concussions. What are some of the injuries encompassed within that sort of broad term of a TBI?
So traumatic brain injury is a TBI, and it's anything that obviously injures the brain. You might have an injury that's a jolt to the body and not even specifically the head that can rock the brain back and forth and cause bruising, could cause bleeding, obviously any blunt force, falls, skull fractures. I mentioned anoxia, which is an oxygen-deprived brain. Anything over 4 minutes is going to cause brain injury. So you would consider, obviously somebody in a fire with smoke inhalation or drowning, or any kind of constricture where they're not able to get, or blood clot where they're not able to get oxygen to the brain. So there are a lot of various ways you can get injured in the brain, and each one of those has their own grade of severity. But they all encompass traumatic brain injury, and they're all injuries that you want to avoid.
Right.
Accidents, yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier you see a lot of high schoolers with concussions, and I think you specifically said sports. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the demographics? So high schoolers, are they more prone than other age groups to get these types of things in your experience? Or what's the most common age group in addition to high schoolers that you see? And in your experience, why is that, would you say?
So the most common reason for a brain injury is falls. That constitutes almost half of all brain injuries.
Oh, wow.
And then you look at the highest risk group, and that would be children under the age of 4. And you consider that age group because they can fall off, they can fall off high for them if they're small, high surfaces and hurt themselves. Then the next age group would be high school, so age 15 to 19. They're just a high risk age group by themselves. And then they're also a bigger number are playing sports at that time. So they're really at risk. They're driving, they're taking on new jobs, and just, child development, they're a little on the high risk anyway.
Right.
And then the next leading age group would be the elderly, over 75. And again, they can fall quite easily due to medication or just weakness. So those would be the three highest age groups or groups of people for TBIs. And where I work in the high school setting, I definitely see my fair share.
So for all those different age groups you mentioned, for the people that might not immediately recognize that they suffered a TBI, what are some types of symptoms that people really should look for or be cognizant of?
Well, if we were to break it down to those age groups, it kind of all looks the same. I'd say the only difference to discern is, let's say, the parent of a young child.
Mm-hmm.
They find, the child's bumped their head or with a fall, and they're trying to discern whether or not the child should be seen, how serious it is. I would say for that parent or caregiver, they should really consider if the baby's really lethargic, if the baby is inconsolable, the crying just continues, and especially if the baby doesn't eat very well. But if there's any concern that that child fell, whether it was a witnessed fall and that child hit their head, or an unwitnessed and you assumed, you really should get that child evaluated, because especially with a baby, they can't tell you how they feel.
Right.
The older age group, they can, and that can get a little difficult to discern, because sometimes, especially in population that I work with, the student athlete, they're typically a student athlete on the field, and they don't want to come out of the game. So they shake it off, right? They deny their symptoms, but at least they can tell you how they feel. Mm-hmm. Hopefully with this recording and so many other really great educational programs out there for high schools throughout the country, they're really trying to raise awareness, and coaches and parents, to not always take the student athlete's word for it, because like I said, they may just feel like they just got to get back in the game. Right. But you'd want to look for that age group, again, for any change of level of consciousness, if they seem a little out of it, if they've had any kind of, amnesia to the event, where they can't remember what happened. There's just a whole host I could go on. Obviously, if they have headache and nausea, vomiting, I could go through all those symptoms. And there's a lot, to discern what's a real emergency. I would say you should consider any head injury an emergency, in the sense that you may not need to call an ambulance for every single bang to the head, because not every bang to the head is serious. But you should consider knowing the signs to look for, to be sure, to discern, when do I have to get this child or person evaluated.
Now, when the signs and symptoms, when those are discernible, and either whether it's by a parent seeing it or the person experiencing themselves or a caretaker, what kind of doctor and specialist should you seek out? I mean, I know you mentioned, obviously, or the emergency room, of course, is an obvious choice with a immediately seriously recognizable injury. But so after a person's been diagnosed with a TBI of sorts, where do you go from there? Like, what kind of specialist should you seek out? What kind of doctor should you be checking in with regularly?
Well, so what I see in my experience is a parent will take their child to the emergency room if it's evenings and off hours. You don't want to really wait on it if you're concerned by their symptoms. And again, I reiterated some of those symptoms. Obviously, you would call 911 if the person you found has been found to have any kind of loss of consciousness, where they were out, and severe complaints of headache. Obviously a pupil is a different size. You would call 911. So often parents will take their child to the emergency room, and you're right, they may get diagnosed and then told to go home and see their primary. It's really important to see the primary. I think a lot of guardians think that they were seen by a doctor, so they're good. And then they'll just go with the emergency room discharge instructions, which aren't really personal to their child. So their primary is really key, because the primary knows what other considerations there are, and they know that person, that child best. And I keep referring to the high school student, but you could say the same if you were dealing with an elderly person
For anyone.
or your little baby, because that primary knows that person best, their patient
Mhm.
best, what medicines they're on, what other health issues they may have. That may complicate the evaluation and assessment as to the severity of the concussion.
Now, beyond the primary care physician portion, I
Mhm.
know a lot of times in the TBI cases that our law firm has dealt with, care and treatment after the fact is so, so important. And the value of a second opinion can be really the make or break of a person's outcome. So, beyond the primary care stage, what would you suggest for people dealing with TBIs or caregivers? What kind of specialists should they be seeing? Should they be seeing a neurologist? Should they be seeing someone at a concussion clinic or stuff like that? What kind of questions are they supposed to be asking and who are they supposed to be asking them of?
Well, so that's a great point. I think, now that the word's out, you have a lot of people with a small little bang to the head saying, oh my gosh, it could be a concussion.
Right.
Um,
Way more awareness now, definitely.
right. So my feeling is if the primary physician, we'll just use a high school athlete, if the pediatrician tells the parent, here are some accommodations and considerations for their recovery, I want you to follow at home.
Mhm.
And I could tell you that that may look like rest for 2 or 3 days, then get slowly back to school, maybe just partial days. Be sure to let the school know ahead of time. Obviously, no sports. The accommodations may be, you know, um, partial days to school, no tests, no computer screens, not even a microscope. The focus of the eyes is going to trigger anything that triggers worsening symptoms, whether it be a headache or nausea, should be stopped immediately. So you're correct. The recovery period immediately after the injury is really important
Mhm.
because you can forecast the recovery long term, how soon they recover. The general rule of thumb is, in my experience with concussions, is if after 2 weeks those symptoms aren't really, going away, declining, and the student athlete's starting to feel a little more able to read at longer periods of time, able to get on their phone for longer periods of time or the computer screen, then you can feel comfortable that they're following the progression of recovery that it would be expected. A lot of what I've learned has come from the concussion clinic through Dr. Cantu. We've mentioned him before. He's just a guru
Right.
on.
Yes, I'm familiar with him.
He's great. He would suggest the same thing, roughly around 2 or 3 weeks, but probably not more than that. And so I've often called parents after, let's say, 2 weeks when their student is still really, really complaining of symptoms that really aren't getting better. That I'll suggest then it's really definitely time to see a neurologist. Now, they can always go much sooner. Um, and a concussion clinic is always, in my opinion, the best place to start, um, to seek out that neurologist. But you can also, Children's Hospital, you can go to your local hospital's neurology departments for a great neurologist. But a neuropsychologist would be another person,
Mhm.
specialty to see. And then what they can then do is do further tests. They might do impact testing. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah,
that.
when you say impact testing in the neurological setting, what exactly does that look for?
Well, I couldn't give you, it's a pretty comprehensive exam and it's kind of based on a point system. And what they basically do is, so let's just say a parent brings their child in for the neurology initial evaluation.
Mhm.
They typically start with, well, my experience is they'll often start with this impact test kind of look. It's actually called, there's an impact test that's on the computer, and then there's a self-evaluation that's called the acute concussion evaluation um, um, plan. The student or the patient, I keep saying student, would assess, have I had a headache in the last 24 hours? Was I nauseous in the last 24 hours? And they go through a whole bunch of potential symptoms that they want to evaluate. on a scale.
Mhm.
And then that neurologist will look at that, and then with every appointment later, they'll see if, within that 24 hours of that visit, that patient is getting better. The scale, let's say it's on a scale of 1 to 7, on the third visit, now they're, doing better, and they don't feel that headache is as bad as a 10. So you were suggesting, when do they see a second opinion? I would say second opinion if the recovery isn't within the reasonable time frame, which I would say, 2-3 weeks. Generally symptomology of concussions get better, even if you've got some lingering ones, by about 3 months. I would say after 2 weeks, see a second opinion, and then start down the road of a neurologist.
Now, for the more severe TBIs that really go beyond the concussion, the usual concussion type symptoms and time frame, what different types of treatment methods are available? As someone who's suffering from a severe TBI who requires a caregiver for basic stuff, what type of treatments should a caregiver sort of be seeking out or be staying on top of for the person they're caring for?
So what kind of doctor you're saying, or what kind of recovery care they should be?
What kind of recovery care, I guess? Like, is there a certain type of physical therapy? Is there cognitive counseling? Things like that, just different types of treatment methods available.
So there's a whole host. It's very specific to the personal injury that patient would have. So, I can give you a good example. So I'll first go through, yes, there's physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, neuropsychiatrists are really very important.
When you say neuropsychiatrist, forgive me, what's the main goal of what a neuropsychiatrist does for treatment?
Well, so
What's the
there's
purpose of that, I guess, is a better question.
okay. So there's when the brain has been injured,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the computer for our body and everything that functions. But there's the chemical balance that's also been disrupted. So neurotransmitting chemicals, and so that can affect our emotional status, our mental status easily after an injury. So a neuropsychiatrist can pull in the brain and the chemical part as well, and kind of they match. A lot of again, high schoolers, there's a component of anxiety and depression that can come from a concussion. Oftentimes caregivers believe it's just because they've had to slow down, they're out of their sports, they're feeling anxious because they're getting behind schoolwork, but there's also a biological reason for it. And that's why it's really good to have that specialty, to be keeping an eye. Often you go on to get some kind of therapy that will kind of help in their recovery.
Now, as far as those different types of recoveries that you mentioned, for the more severe TBIs, both in the younger age demographic and the older one, do you have any tips on how to really sort of adjust or adapt to this new normal that people are experiencing, based off what you've seen in your profession?
Well, the new normal is very frustrating generally for anybody suffering from it. And any caregiver, a parent or spouse that sees somebody suffering from a TBI, it's easy for me to say have patience. I think the new normal is something that is so difficult, I think, for people suffering, that they need to seek out every support they can. There are a lot of informational places to go on the internet and foundations to find, but there are supports regionally here and there to help parents, to help spouses. There's even student athlete support groups, and that's just I feel that's very important.
Definitely. I would imagine that support is key in a better recovery outcome. I know you mentioned some support groups and stuff in our area here. If you're able to, do you know specifically what types of groups are available or any type of community outreach that you've witnessed and or even referred people to in your job at the school?
So for information, it's been the Center for Disease Control's Heads Up program. That's incredible. There's videos, there's testimony of student athletes talking about their own experience. There's parents and teachers talking about what they've seen in the classroom or at home. The new normal at home, let's say for the high schooler, could be that the parent now is constantly reminding the child, what they can't do. And you can only imagine how that goes over.
Right. Yeah, that would frustrate me too.
Gosh, yeah. So there's tips, so some of the support groups could be found right in their own town. Support at the school setting could be their guidance counselors. Sometimes they're coaches even. On a state level, we have Spalding Rehab, which is in Boston. We have, obviously, the DPH has an injury prevention chapter that they can go to under mass.gov. There's the Brain Injury Association of Massachusetts. They have socials. They have fundraising events.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. There's the Concussion Legacy Foundation. They often will have, I think Dr. Cantu might be behind that. They have retired professional athletes that will often go into schools to kind of educate schools as a whole, but targeting the age group they're trying to get to, especially the student athlete, on the importance of recognizing and owning up to the fact that they may have a concussion. And I've seen some of those presentations and they've been amazing. And then of course I would consider, if there's a therapist that the person's attending, to ask locally through that, therapy,
Now, I know, and there's so many situations, and I know you mentioned the most common cause that you've seen anyways for TBIs is the fall factor, which I'm sure a lot of times cannot be controlled. But for certain situations that people do have control of avoiding risk that could potentially lead to a TBI, what would be any prevention tips that you might have, just to put yourself in a better position to not suffer this type of injury when at all possible?
Well, you'd have to break it down, I think, to...
Yeah. So let me ask you a better question. So there's obviously situations where, you get in a car accident that's not your fault and you can't control that. But for the high school age group that you mentioned is just already an at-risk group, what type of safety precautions, just day to day, should people be aware of that could really put them in a safer position physically to avoid a head injury?
Well, you talked about accidents, wearing their seatbelt, that's often a lifesaver and a brain saver. Wearing helmets for everything that needs a helmet, from riding your bike to rollerblading to, any of the sports that require, including a lot of kids choose not to, adults choose not to with horseback riding. I also think for people in the home, when it comes to the elderly, look at their home and look at safety. Are there rugs flat on the floors? Are there stairs? Are there railings for stairs if they're there? And in the bathrooms, there's so many falls. And look at the medication of the elderly, for the caregiver to say, okay, some of this medication causes dizziness. How we manage that potential side effect to prevent a fall. And then for the little ones, I cringe every time I see a little child in a grocery store in that little seat, and they're crawling up, they're standing up. And
oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Never overestimate your child's athleticism. Looking at the swing sets in the backyard, make sure there's sand or some kind of bark mulch or something to soften the landing if they fell off a swing or fell out of a little tree fort or something.
Mhm. That's all great advice too, because I wouldn't even. I'm thinking of my own grandparents who are elderly. I would never think about, do they have rugs in their house? Do they have railings? That's not something I would necessarily think of right away. So that's definitely helpful and practical advice. So we really appreciate that. Well, thank you so much, Meg, for coming on and talking about this. I know I learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time to share a little bit of insight of what you see on the day-to-day. And just thank you so much, and we really appreciate it. I'm sure our viewers will too.
Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you so much.